The gate opened. They carried no weapons, only faith. On the other side, the roar. And in the center, a sand-covered floor, ready to drink more blood. There was no trial, no defense. The crime was refusing to deny the name of Christ. When the lions charged, the crowd roared louder, not out of compassion, but for pleasure. Rome turned death into entertainment and faith into a sentence. Every scream of pain was swallowed by the frenzy, and the silent certainty that even surrounded by beasts, truth would not be devoured. And if you, like me, are drawn to real stories that challenge what the books tell us, subscribe now so you don't miss the upcoming chapters, and let me know in the comments which country you're watching from. I always read them, because some arenas weren't built for gladiators, but to silence prayers. And every stone of the Colosseum still echoes the voices of those who chose to die rather than be silenced. In the early centuries of the Republic, Rome dealt with its enemies through methodical brutality. Rebels who rose against the state, thieves who disrupted the order, slaves who dared to flee, all were condemned to public torture. This was called damnatio ad bestias, the sentencing of a living body to the claws and fangs of beasts imported from faraway lands. A spectacle of suffering staged to educate through fear. But this punishment, which began as a legal tool, quickly turned into mass entertainment. When the first Christians refused to sacrifice to the Roman gods, the courts found in them a new kind of convict, not for theft, but for conviction, not for betrayal, but for faith. And this faith, unshaken even under the lash, stirred the crowds more than any sword fight ever could. Rome discovered that the suffering of believers was different, silent, unwavering, without complaint, and because of that, more unsettling. Every time a Christian was thrown naked before a beast, the city gained its spectacle, but the empire lost a bit more of its control. Because the more they tried to silence faith with roars, the louder it cried in the hearts of the onlookers. The shift from public humiliation to brutal execution didn't begin with swords, but with whispers. First came the warnings, then the arrests, and soon the arena gates. Rome, with all its military glory, found itself destabilized not by armed revolts, but by whispered prayers in the underground. Christians didn't carry spears. They carried convictions. They met in catacombs, exchanged letters, fasted, prayed for those who hated them, but their lack of violence didn't make them harmless. On the contrary, to an empire built on emperor worship, anyone who refused to bow was seen as a threat. In the eyes of the powerful, they were doing the unthinkable, disobeying with gentleness, and gentleness, when firm, is more terrifying than chaos. When a citizen refused to offer incense to Caesar out of loyalty to Jesus, he was to Rome undermining the entire political structure. It wasn't enough to kill such insubordination. They had to turn it into a warning. In that context, the death penalty became theater. Executions were staged. With each new Christian prisoner, a new attraction was announced. Lions, leopards, bears, starving beasts kept in cages to devour believers in public squares. Young women, mothers, children, elders, no one was spared. But then something inexplicable began to happen. Many spectators left the arenas, converted. Not because of the pain, but because of the strength of those who died. They prayed while being torn apart. They forgave while bleeding. They looked to the heavens, even as death came through claws, and that sowed unrest. If that faith endured even this, what else could it do? The goal was to crush a belief, but with every execution, Rome planted a memory, an image no one could erase. People who, even in the face of the cruelest end, chose not to back down. That image spread like fire among the poor, the outcast, the soldiers weary of tyranny. And that's how the Christian martyrs stopped being just victims. They became mirrors. Mirrors showing the decay of an empire that needed to kill to stay in power. And at the same time, reflections of a faith that, unlike marble statues, couldn't be shattered by force. As blood soaked the sand of the arena, the empire bled with it, though it didn't yet realize. The smell of blood didn't come from the battlefields, it came from the heart of the city. Rome, so proud of its civilization, turned the Colosseum into a bloody altar where human life was worth less than afternoon amusement. For many, it was entertainment. But for Christians, it was the very doorway to martyrdom. The Colosseum wasn't built for culture. It was shaped by fear. Every step, every hidden corridor, every cage in the underground, all of it had a single purpose: to remind the population who held the power. And for that, killing wasn't enough. It had to be done before eyes hungry for spectacle. The sessions began early. Crowds gathered as if for a festival. Wealthy men placed bets. Children learned to applaud death. Roman women, draped in jewels, brought handkerchiefs to cover their noses, but not their eyes. And the names of the condemned were not always announced. They were simply the Christians, a generic label that masked the humanity of the victims. But inside those walls, the empire lost control of the narrative. Something began to shift. What was meant to be terror turned into testimony. Prisoners entered the arena not with screams, but with hymns. Some knelt, others raised their arms, some even smiled, and that was unsettling. One day, a girl was thrown to the lions. According to letters and oral tradition, she was just over 12 years old. She entered barefoot, hands raised, and began to sing a psalm. The crowd fell silent. The beast hesitated, and even when it attacked, the audience's screams couldn't drown out her final sound, a prayer for her executioners. That's when the turning point began. The Colosseum, once seen as a symbol of imperial glory, began to carry a shadow. Not a shadow of fear, but of shame. The audience started whispering, questioning, doubting. After all, if those people could die with such peace, who was really right? The empire tried to cover it up. They erased names, burned records, destroyed reports, but the ground doesn't forget. The stones where the condemned once walked are still there, and many who take photos at the Colosseum today have no idea they're standing over the bones of martyrs. That arena became an involuntary cathedral, not because of its columns, but because of its echoes. The roar of the beasts fell silent, but the songs of the Christians still crossed through time. And even Rome, with all its power, couldn't silence the kind of faith that would rather die than bow. There, between applause and claws, a kind of resistance was born that no lion could devour. By then, the roaring beasts were no longer enough. The empire needed something more subtle, more legal. That's when the decrees began to appear, one by one. Nero opened the gates of horror with his theatrical fury, blaming the Christians for the fire in Rome. Then came Domitian, and with him the politics of veiled terror. It only took a neighbor's report that someone hadn't offered incense to the Roman gods, and the sentence was sealed. But it was under Diocletian that faith officially became a crime. The so-called Edict of Persecution was more than just a document. It was a systematic attempt to erase a faith with ink, chains, and teeth. Churches were destroyed, scriptures burned, and leaders executed in public squares. And still, nothing stopped those people. The more they tried to silence the followers of Christ, the more they multiplied. For every martyr that fell, a new convert rose. The state began to realize the problem wasn't just what they believed, but what they refused to deny. And what disturbed most was the silence. They didn't scream as they died. They sang. They forgave. Dying, they were more powerful than alive. That made no sense to the empire, whose authority depended on fear. The lion was supposed to have the final word, but with the Christians, not even that was enough. Rome, obsessed with controlling bodies and minds, found itself facing something it couldn't chain: conviction. The edicts weren't written with quills. They were carved with the blood of innocents. In every square, every amphitheater, every damp prison cell, the same message echoed, cloaked in legality: deny or die. But the answer was always the same: Christ is Lord. Not said in defiance, but in certainty. A certainty no empire ever managed to revoke. because to them, faith wasn't a choice, it was identity. And when the state declared war on that, it didn't realize it was watering the seed of something that would endure through centuries. The stands were full, men drank wine, children ate dates. The atmosphere was festive, and the show was about to begin. But what emerged from the arena gates wasn't a dangerous criminal, nor an armed enemy. It was an elderly woman with white hair, leaning on a wooden cane, her eyes turned to the sky. At her side, two young boys gripped her hands tightly. The only weapon they carried was faith, and to Rome, that was intolerable. When Christians began to be hunted, the empire didn't stop at leaders and preachers. They wanted to wipe out the idea at its root, and that meant targeting families. A father's confession of faith was enough for his wife, children, and even servants to be accused by association. There was no fair trial, no need for evidence. Just one question: do you believe in Christ? A yes, even from a child's lips, was enough for condemnation. In ancient records, there are reports of 7-year-old girls being thrown into the arena with their mothers, of elders tied up and left as bait, while starving lions were slowly released to applause. The goal wasn't just to kill, it was to traumatize, to make faith synonymous with pain, to show that no bond, not even family, could protect the followers of the Nazarene. This strategy wasn't just mass execution, it was a message with a clear target: renounce or lose everything. The emperors knew that to destroy a belief, it wasn't enough to strike the pulpits. They had to hit the cradles, the hallways of homes, the quiet moments of prayer around a meal. And so Rome threw entire families to the beasts, believing that fear would silence the song. But something strange happened. The more the innocent bled, the louder courage echoed. Some children died singing. Some elders prayed with their final breath. The empire watched, bewildered, as its public extermination policy gave rise to something indestructible, a collective memory of resistance. And even when names were erased from records, the spilled blood inscribed on the stones, a truth that not even roars could swallow. There was something in those people that not even death could silence. The roars didn't come only from the beasts. They came from the packed stands. Whole families filled their seats as if they were at a festival, not an execution. The Colosseum, which today is a postcard image, was once a precise and cruel cog in an economic machine that profited from the agony of those who dared to believe differently. The beasts, brought from Africa, Asia Minor, and the farthest provinces, weren't just tools of punishment, they were investments. Lions, panthers, bears, hyenas, fed, trained, and enraged, waiting for their next victim. The organizers knew death alone wasn't enough. It needed spectacle. The slower and more painful the scene, the higher the financial return. Tickets were priced according to position. The closer to the arena, the higher the cost, and the more graphic the horror. The elite sat in the shade, wine in hand, placing bets. Which beast would tear off the first arm? Which child would scream the loudest? Which Christian would dare sing instead of cry? There are even records of improvised contests where the audience chose the execution order. Other people's suffering had become a commodity, and Rome profited from every drop of blood. Behind the scenes, blacksmiths forged chains and iron collars. Seamstresses and servants cleaned up traces from the previous session. Guards handed out lashes to keep captives silent. Merchants sold amulets, figurines, and even pieces of stained fabric, claiming they had martyr's blood, even if it was just red paint. The horror was a cycle. The empire condemned, the people watched, commerce profited, and the machine turned. It wasn't just punishment. It was a project. The goal was to make pain into a show, faith into a crime, loyalty into a reason for public ridicule. And so, for years, generations grew up applauding corpses and celebrating deaths as if they were games. But there was something Rome hadn't foreseen. Between the screams of beasts and the applause of the masses, a new force was born, silent but unbreakable. Because the more Christians died, the more their stories multiplied. And it's within this contradiction, between prophet and sacrifice, violence and hope, that the narrative unfolds, because not every empire lasts, but some seeds, watered with blood, survive to this day. In the middle of the frenzied crowd, as everyone waited for another spectacle of pain, it was silence that froze Rome for a few moments. She was only 15 years old. Her name never officially made it into books, but letters from the early Christians speak of a small, fragile girl brought to the arena for refusing to burn incense to the imperial gods. She was just a young woman, but with eyes that seemed to understand something the world was still trying to erase. She walked alone, without chains, escorted only by 2 soldiers who avoided her gaze. Accounts say she didn't tremble, she didn't scream, she only whispered, and when she reached the center of the arena, she knelt. She didn't cry for help, she didn't beg for justice, she simply prayed. While the crowd shouted and the drum signaled the release of the beasts, that girl lifted her eyes and murmured words that few could hear, but that would never leave the memory of those present. The iron gate burst open. A lion, large, thin, starving, ran toward her. The entire Colosseum stood up. Someone bet it would be the fastest death of the morning. But for a moment, everything stopped. The beast approached, growled, but didn't immediately attack. Some said she looked the lion in the eye. Others claimed her face glowed with a light that couldn't be explained. Some swore the animal hesitated, turned around and roared at the sky. A guard threw a spear to provoke it, and then everything ended in seconds. The girl's body fell, but the impact of what happened that day lasted for generations. Those in the stands couldn't applaud. Many left in silence. Some soldiers abandoned their posts that same week, and a woman present at the arena wrote a letter to her sister saying, "Today I saw courage face death, and for the first time I wondered if I'm truly alive." The empire wanted terror, but without meaning to, it planted a seed, because that teenage girl, whose only weapon was a prayer, didn't just endure the spectacle, she turned it into testimony. In a world where kings feared faith and crowds demanded blood, it was a young woman, kneeling with steady eyes and gentle words, who left the deepest mark on that ground. Rome officially forgot her, but the Christians remembered. And in every generation her unknown name is repeated in other voices, other mouths, other lives, that keep praying, even when the lion approaches. The Colosseum was full, as always. The morning was sweltering, the air thick with dust and anticipation. But during that session, something didn't go according to script. The eyes of one of the guards, a tall man, used to the smell of blood and the roar of the crowd, could no longer look away from the woman kneeling in the center of the arena. She trembled, but not from fear. Her lips moved, whispering a prayer. The beast drew near, but she didn't ask for help. She gave thanks. The guard, named Dario, had been trained to obey without thinking. For years, he had led hundreds to their deaths. But in that moment, something inside him broke. It was as if that courageous silence had reached the space where blind obedience used to live. It wasn't just a woman being devoured. It was a living testimony of a faith that would not bow, not even before death. Dario turned his face away, but another guard, his childhood friend Publius, saw the same scene, and he didn't look away. He kept his eyes fixed as the lioness circled the woman and, inexplicably, backed off. It made no sense. It went against everything they had learned, against everything they had been paid to uphold. At the end of the day, the two didn't speak. But the next night, they entered the barracks together and tore their service cloaks. In the following weeks, similar accounts began to spread. One soldier refused the order to whip an elderly Christian. Another began hiding forbidden writings in his belt. Some were secretly baptized in dark catacombs. Others, bolder, publicly confessed their new faith and paid with their lives. There are preserved records of a guard named Fabius, who before hundreds of spectators threw down his spear and declared, "If these men and women die with peace in their eyes, then maybe we are the truly condemned ones." The next day, Fabius was thrown naked to the beasts. He didn't scream, he didn't run, he died on his knees. Rome hoped to create fear, but unknowingly it had created martyrs, and the system began to crack in the most unexpected places, inside the very walls of power. Every soldier who surrendered to the faith became a new testimony spreading through the barracks, the taverns, the streets. The spectacle became a revelation, the arena, a pulpit. The death of converted guards was no longer just punishment. It was the admission that even the armed hands of the empire were being overcome by a force they couldn't see, but everyone could feel. And what began as a ritual of punishment now revealed that the empire was being invaded, not by swords, but by a faith no lion could devour. The beasts roared, the crowd applauded, and the emperors believed they were winning. But Rome, in its delusion of control, didn't realize that every body thrown onto the sand left something behind, a name, a memory, a question in the heart of those watching, and a seed that couldn't be crushed. The goal was simple: to eradicate Christianity through terror, to show what happened to those who refused the gods of the state. But the result was something else. Countless times, right after executions, ordinary people sought out the catacombs, whispered prayers they didn't yet understand, touched relics stained with blood. What was meant as a warning became fascination. What was supposed to incite fear sparked hope. Faith did not die with the martyrs. It spread in silence, like incense burned on the altar. Writings began to circulate among the faithful, hand-copied at the risk of death. Small groups gathered in city undergrounds, in abandoned houses, even inside army barracks. And there they spoke of the God of the persecuted, the crucified Christ now invoked by men and women who knew they could be next. The ground that received the bodies also received a promise: whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. That was the phrase Roman soldiers saw carved in hiding places on the damp walls of catacombs. That was the kind of faith that neither swords nor decrees nor beasts could erase. Many who watched the executions began to doubt. What made those people die singing? Why no begging? Why no despair? The questions began to pile up, and with them, unexpected conversions. Sons of senators, influential merchants, even military officers. The empire itself, unknowingly, became the messenger of the very faith it wanted to silence. The prisoner transports, the rumors in the taverns, the names carved with knives into hidden stones, all contributed to carrying the gospel to places the disciples would never have reached on their own. And that's how Rome, while spreading fear, watered the roots of a spiritual revolution. Not a rebellion of swords, but an inward uprising. Not a visible army, but a people who preferred death over denial. Blood didn't silence the faith, it nourished it. And the emperors realized too late that they had created with their own hands what they most feared. A movement that couldn't be killed because it had already learned to rise again in every new believer. The roaring ceased. The iron gates were shut. The smell of blood dried with time. And slowly, the arenas that once witnessed martyrdom became ruins, where tourists walk without knowing what once lay beneath their feet. Rome offered no apology, built no monuments, raised no memorials. It simply went silent. For centuries, the empire and its heirs treated the past as an inconvenient echo, a whisper better left unheard. The names of the martyrs were swept from official records. Imperial documents omitted the blood spectacles as if they were exaggerations of a distant era. What remained was stone, cold, and mute. But it was the rulers who forgot, never the people. In catacombs and hidden manuscripts, small Christian communities kept alive the memory of those who had faced beasts out of love for Christ. They had no golden altars, no pulpits, but they had inherited scars. Names whispered in prayer, relics wrapped in cloth, hidden beneath bricks, stories passed from generation to generation like embers kept beneath the ashes of time. As centuries passed and palaces changed hands, the Colosseum remained standing, not as glory, but as a silent witness to a system that tried to kill faith and failed. Grass grew where blood once flowed. The stands were overtaken by moss. But even without a voice, that circle of stone continued to carry the memory of what Rome tried to hide. For a long time, the church avoided speaking openly about the atrocities. The fear of provoking new persecution or of appearing as a faith born out of trauma kept the subject locked behind walls. And so, the deaths ceased to be mentioned publicly. They were left in the shadows, like a corpse hidden in the basement of Western history. It was only many centuries later that archaeologists, historians, and religious scholars began piecing together the fragments of truth: inscriptions, bones, coded manuscripts, cave paintings in catacombs. Every piece pointed to the same suppressed reality. The empire had fed human beings to beasts, and that could no longer be swept under the stones. The silence at last began to crumble, but it had lasted too long. And the silence, that may have been the cruelest judgment, because it didn't erase the pain, it only disguised it. And today, as visitors walk through the ruins of the Colosseum, they see only broken columns. But for those who know the story, every stone still cries out for those the world tried to forget. But heaven never stopped counting. For centuries, Roman soil carried a secret, a heavy silence buried beneath stones, dust, and imperial pride. But time, which erases speeches, also reveals what was hidden. And when the excavations began, Rome was forced to look inward, literally. The first shovel removed dirt. The second found fragments. On the third, bones emerged. Human bones, many, intertwined, disfigured, disordered. And soon after, a crude inscription, carved shakily in stone, "In Christ we conquer." Archaeologists, historians, and clergy took turns around the ruins with wide eyes. What had long been dismissed as religious exaggeration began to be confirmed in brutal detail. Beneath the stands, among the foundations of ancient arenas, they found rudimentary crucifixes, Christian medallions, fabric remnants, and even rings with biblical inscriptions. These weren't trophies, they were evidence. Each unearthed skeleton seemed to tell a wordless story: crushed skulls, broken ribs, fractured jaws. These weren't natural deaths, they were signs of execution, and not in silence but before crowds. Some scholars tried to reduce the findings to common rites of the time, but the evidence defied denial. There were too many patterns, too many symbols, and too much faith buried with them. A small charred papyrus still carried a legible fragment from the Gospel of John. "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." The narrative shifted. The Colosseum wasn't just an architectural landmark. It was an unofficial mausoleum of thousands of unknowns who died for refusing to bow. Men, women, and children who carried no swords but bore invisible crosses to their last breath and left their footprints among the ruins. And the more they dug, the more they found. Smaller arenas in cities like Carthage, Smyrna, and Antioch began to reveal similar structures, all with the same pattern: underground chambers, modified cages, and human remains with Christian symbols. It was as if the empire had built inverted temples, where instead of worship there was spectacle, and where faith was sacrificed as a public offering. With every discovery, the past forced open the doors of the present. And the question echoed: how much blood is needed for a truth to no longer be ignored? Today, some museum displays quietly exhibit objects retrieved from these sites, but many remain stored away in archives, far from the public eye, perhaps out of shame, perhaps out of fear of what might still come to light, because bones don't speak, they scream. And Rome, even draped in modernity, still walks upon the history it tried to hide. These discoveries aren't just archaeology, they are testimony. They are proof that neither stones nor beasts were able to bury a faith that remained alive, even beneath the ruins. The ruins speak, but it was the silence of the martyrs that crossed the centuries like an eternal whisper. When the bones were gathered, When the names could no longer be remembered, what remained was something impossible to bury, the living memory, and it wasn't preserved only in stone. It was etched into the souls of those who came after. The first Christians didn't leave behind theoretical books. They didn't build cathedrals or establish schools of theology. They lived what they believed, right up to their final breath, and when they died, they didn't leave doctrines. They left example. The stories of those who were torn by lions, crucified in public squares, or burned as human torches were not confined to grim reports. They became embers that reignited faith in every following generation. For the persecuted believers of the Middle Ages, for the missionaries in the New World, for the hidden Christians in Soviet basements, there was always one memory. Someone already died for this, and did not stay silent. In sacred art, the martyrs became icons. In liturgy, their names were remembered on holy days, and in every corner of the world where a cross was raised, behind it stood the silent shadow of someone who once faced the arena and never returned. But the legacy goes beyond religion. It is human. It is the remembrance that there is something stronger than the fear of death, something that neither the crowd's screams nor imperial decrees could erase. When faith becomes courage, it doesn't need to win, only to endure. And in that endurance it triumphs. That's why the Colosseum became a double symbol, of horror, yes, but also of hope. Because there, where death was spectacle, eternity slipped in through the eyes of men and women who would not bow their heads. There, Rome tried to bring an end, and right there, unknowingly, it planted beginnings. That is the power of the martyrs. They didn't want to become heroes. They just couldn't deny who they were. And for that reason, even without a sword, they shook the foundations of an empire. If this story shocked you, know that Rome has many others that never reached the classroom. The same civilization that built aqueducts and colosseums also erected spectacles of blood, pain, and enforced silence. Subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the next video. And tell me in the comments, what detail of this story impacted you the most? I read everything, because sometimes what the world applauds, heaven mourns, and there are hidden chapters of humanity that still need to be exposed.